These old caves on the east side of Haida Gwaii, we're finding evidence for bear hunting between 13,000 and 11,500 years ago. But along with that, there's a little bit of evidence relating to the ancient marine environment as well. We have brown bear bones. These are bears that are extinct on Haida Gwaii for the last 12,000 years. And their bone chemistry shows that they ate both terrestrial and marine foods. We also have thousands and thousands of salmon bones, including a number that have been DNA identified to sockeye salmon. And so clearly the marine system was functioning 14,000 years ago.
Well, the last 2,000 years is a time period in which the environment is very similar to what we know today. The cedar, hemlock, and spruce forests that we're familiar with in Haida Gwaii were well established by this time, and sea levels had made their way back down to present levels. In addition, the Haida population within the last 2,000 years probably numbered around 20 to 30,000 for all of Haida Gwaii. That's quite a bit more than today, which I believe is around 5,000 or so. In the last 2,000 years, we can actually find a lot more archaeological sites than we can for that really early period. They're much more visible, very present along today's current shoreline. So people over the last 2,000 years would have been living in large sedentary villages or towns, much like what we see in this historic image. Today, however, a lot of these locations have suffered with time and decomposition, and people no longer living in these areas. And so archaeologically, what we see are, in some cases, standing house posts and beams, sometimes also the depressions from where there were terraced subterranean floors within the houses. But not always. Sometimes these features have completely decomposed, the depressions have filled in. And so what we look for as archaeologists are the midden deposits that are created where people have lived. And as people live in these places for extended periods of time, the midden develops, and you can start to see layers within the deposits, stratigraphic layers. So you can see in this image a number of these different layers. And preserved within these are all of the bits of evidence that we use to pull together how people were living in the past. These bones are really important in terms of enabling us to understand people's diet, what they were hunting and fishing, but also what the environment was like at the time. So we can look at these bones and we can determine not only if we're dealing with land mammal or sea mammal, bird or fish, but in good cases of preservation, which is really typical within midden, you can actually identify these bones to a specific species. So you can tell a seal vertebra from sea lion, or you can differentiate between salmon and halibut and rockfish and herring and things like that. Now this process is something that one of our collaborators, Dr. Trevor Orchard, did for his PhD thesis at a number of sites dating to the last 2,000 years in Gwaii Haanas. And essentially he looked at all of the faunal remains from a number of sites dating to this time period, and he found that the majority of sites are dominated by fish. We do have some mammal and we have some bird, but certainly the majority of faunal remains come from fish. And when he looked at these more specifically, so again we have the different sites divided here, he found that salmon was by far the most abundant fish species, followed by rockfish in yellow, and then other fish sort of grouped together there in blue. Now what's interesting though is when he looked at these over time, and in this graph time is represented down the right hand side, most recent at the top and oldest at the bottom, and he looked at these different fish assemblages and he found that the rockfish dominated sites tended to be the older sites, and that salmon was most dominant in the more recent time period. So around 1,000 years ago, there started to be this shift from rockfish dominance to salmon dominance. We know that environmentally, for some parts of the northwest coast, there was a slight increase in sockeye salmon, and some locations perhaps attributed to changes in ocean circulation. So maybe we're seeing the effects of something environmental. But on the other hand, we also know that culturally there were a lot of changes that happened with fishing techniques. And in addition to the bone, the changes in bone, we also see some changes in shellfish. At one site on Huxley Island, for example, in the older midden deposits, we see shellfish is dominated by barnacle and mussel, whereas more recently we see a shift to butter clam and little neck. So again, why are we seeing these changes? These are questions that we're quite interested in exploring a little bit more. So this summer, we began a preliminary research program focused on fish traps and possible intertidal garden features. This is a picture of a classic clam garden that was taken in the Broughton Archipelago, which is located sort of northeastern Vancouver Island, photo by Mary Morris. And in this area, they've found hundreds of these clam garden features. And essentially, these are features that were used by the First Nations to really enhance the clam productivity of an area. So there have been a number of these found in the Broughton Archipelago, a couple on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there are a few in the Gulf Islands, and a few up in southeast Alaska. But it's really a feature that we as archaeologists have just become aware of and are interested in finding more. So they're interesting features, and we wanted to see if we could find any of them in Gwaii Haanas. We only had a few days of very low tide to look, and we found a couple of features that looked interesting, such as this one on Huxley Island. So we spent most of our time looking at fish traps and weirs, and these are features that you can find in the intertidal zone, upstreams or in estuaries. And essentially they're features that allowed people to catch great quantities of fish by sort of corralling them into certain locations or certain pools where people would be waiting with nets or spears, and really an efficient way of harvesting fish. We're looking at an example of a fish trap made out of boulders. So you have an accumulation of boulders. This is an image here that was drawn of this particular stream in '92. And this here is the boulder alignment that's allowing the people to corral the different fish. We're seeing a remnant of that particular feature right here. But as you move further upstream, you can see more boulder alignments, some that cut off the passage of the stream, so that acts as a natural barricade for the fish. I mean, now it's much smaller than it would have been at the time of use. But we found a lot of different fish trap features in Matheson Inlet. We carried upstream, and we spent a lot of time mapping these weir features, and in particular this one. So the image over the side is just showing a little schematic of what some of these weirs could look like. Today, again, we're just left with the stakes, and really just a small portion of the stake. Good looks at these traps, and good portions of the actual stakes were made out of sharpened branches, such as this one. Although we did find that there were some portions of the features that had split cedar stakes within them. So we were kind of interested as to whether or not that's a change in technology or if they represent different portions of the features themselves. So we're still working on getting a lot of the results together from the summer. Part of that will involve compiling all of the mapping data that we've generated. Here you can see us using the total station to map in all of the locations of the stakes in this one particular weir feature. So we're pretty excited to see what comes out of this work. There's a wealth of archaeological resources that are preserved within the Gwaii Haanas marine environment. And quite commonly when we talk about an NMCA, we're thinking about plant animals and species, or plants and animal species that are in this environment. But there are also a great number of cultural resources that are really, really well preserved in this environment. Archaeology, I think, has some interesting roles to play within the NMCA as well, because we have an archaeological record that goes back before pre-industrial times. And often fisheries records may only span a few decades, but the archaeological record will go back hundreds and thousands of years and give us some interesting information when thinking about what a marine ecosystem is all about.